The sun was sinking behind the jagged hills of Dust Creek, bleeding its last red light across the dirt-streaked faces of a weary crowd. The air was thick with dust and desperation. Men from every corner of the frontier, ranchers, miners, drifters, and soldiers gone to seed, had gathered in the square for what passed as entertainment in a dying town, the women's auction. They stood in a line near the gallows post, 5 of them, each a prisoner of circumstance. Some were widows of men who died in the mines. Others were captives taken from burned-out settlements or forgotten frontier towns. The sheriff pretended not to see the cruelty of it, smoking his pipe as the auctioneer shouted names, ages, and starting bids. At the edge of the crowd stood Eli Carter, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing a face that looked carved from stone. He wasn't there to buy anyone. He'd come into town for feed and whiskey. But when he heard the laughter, the jeers, and saw the hollow eyes of the women being sold like mules, something in him twisted. The auctioneer called out, "Next up, number 6, claims she can sew, cook, and keep her mouth shut. A fine bargain if you don't mind a quiet one." From behind the wooden platform, a woman stepped forward, wrapped from head to toe in a heavy gray shawl despite the heat. She didn't look up, didn't flinch when the men shouted crude offers. The crowd murmured. She was different. There was a tension around her, something that made even the drunkest bidder hesitate. "Name?" barked the auctioneer. No reply. Only silence. The man tried again, louder this time. Still, she didn't speak. She stood perfectly still, like she wasn't part of this world at all. The auctioneer sneered and turned to the crowd. Mute, maybe, or cursed? Either way, she don't talk. "Who'll start at $2? A few men laughed and turned away. One muttered, "Ain't worth a dime if she don't scream." That was when Eli spoke, surprising even himself. $3, the auctioneer blinked. "3? Hell, that's more than she's worth, mister." "You sure?" Eli didn't answer. He just stared at the woman. Something about her, maybe the way she held her head high, even in shame, felt like defiance. Or maybe it was the way her stillness reminded him of the dead he'd buried in war. "Sold," the auctioneer shouted, slamming the gavel. To the tall rancher with the cold eyes. The crowd laughed, the sound echoing through the empty street. The woman turned her head then, slowly, and looked at Eli. Her face was hidden by shadow, but her voice, low, calm, and deliberate, cut through the noise like a blade. "You paid for me?" "Now finish it." Eli froze. For a moment, the air around him went still. The auctioneer didn't hear her, too busy collecting his coins. But Eli did. Those words weren't angry or fearful. They were heavy, final. As she stepped down from the platform, Eli reached out to help her. She brushed past him without a glance. Her touch was cold, her movements too smooth, almost weightless. He tried to speak, to ask her name, where she came from, but she only said, "Names don't matter to the dead." The crowd fell quiet as they walked away. Men muttered and spat, whispering about curses and ghosts. But Eli didn't look back. The sun had vanished behind the hills, and the long shadows of Dust Creek stretched toward them like fingers reaching from the grave. Somewhere deep inside, Eli Carter knew that what he'd bought that night wasn't a woman. It was a reckoning, one that had been waiting a long time to find him. The moon had already risen by the time Eli Carter led his horse out of Dust Creek, the woman following behind him in silence. The town's lights faded fast, swallowed by the black horizon. The desert stretched before them, vast, pale, and endless under the silver light. It was a long ride back to Black Hollow Ranch, and every mile seemed heavier than the last. Eli glanced over his shoulder now and then, uncertain what to make of the woman trailing him. Her gray shawl fluttered in the wind, the fabric hiding her face and figure completely. She sat straight on the saddle of his spare mare, moving with the calm rhythm of someone who'd ridden many miles before. Yet she hadn't spoken a single word since they left town. Not one. He tried to break the silence. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice low and rough from dust. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible, came her reply, "Names don't matter to the dead." Eli frowned. "You ain't dead." She turned her head slightly toward him, and he caught a glimpse of one pale eye beneath the shawl's shadow. "Aren't I?" she whispered. The sound of her voice unsettled him. It wasn't angry, but hollow, like wind moving through an empty house. He looked away and focused on the trail, trying to ignore the unease building in his gut. Hours passed. The desert night grew colder. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind began to stir up thin spirals of dust that danced across the plain like restless spirits. Eli offered her water at one stop, but she refused. When he passed her a piece of jerky, she didn't even lift her hand. "Suit yourself," he muttered, tucking the food away. At the river crossing, the horses stopped to drink. The moonlight broke through the clouds, and for a brief second Eli saw her reflection in the rippling water. Her shawl had shifted, revealing her wrists, and the sight made him freeze. They were scarred, burned in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like brands or symbols. He took a hesitant step closer. "You hurt yourself?" Her head snapped up, eyes gleaming like wet stone. "Don't touch what you don't understand, rancher." Eli raised his hands slowly. "Didn't mean no harm." "Everything that means harm starts with those words," she murmured. Then she turned away and guided her horse across the river. The icy current lapped at her boots, yet she didn't flinch, didn't shiver. When they reached the far bank, the wind picked up. Clouds swallowed the moon again, and Eli could barely see her form in the darkness. Only the faint whisper of her horse's hooves told him she was still there. He tried to shake the feeling creeping up his spine. Maybe she'd been through something terrible. God knew half the frontier carried scars like hers. Still, something about her was different. Her silence wasn't born of fear. It was purposeful, like she was waiting for something to happen. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, they reached the outskirts of Black Hollow Ranch. The land stretched wide and lonely, framed by black pines and dry creek beds. The house stood on a rise, a sturdy, weathered cabin with smoke barely curling from its chimney. Eli dismounted and helped her down, though she didn't need his hand. She stepped onto the ground with eerie grace, turning her face toward the cabin. "This where you live?" she asked softly. "For the last 10 years, Eli said, watching her closely. "You'll be safe here." She tilted her head as though studying him, and for the first time he thought he saw a faint smile. Sad, knowing, almost pitying. "No one's safe here," she said. "Not anymore." Then she walked past him toward the cabin, her shadow long and thin in the dawn light, leaving Eli with the uneasy sense that he hadn't brought a woman home at all, but something that had been waiting for him in the dark all along. The wind moaned through the pines that surrounded Black Hollow Ranch, and the old cabin creaked like it was whispering secrets from another time. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Eli Carter sat at the table, his hat resting beside a half-empty bottle. The woman he had brought home, still wrapped in her gray shawl, stood by the window, unmoving, staring into the night as though she could see something out there that he couldn't. Hours had passed since they'd arrived. Eli had shown her the spare room, set out bread and stew, even offered her a blanket, but she hadn't touched a thing. She simply stood there, silent, her back to him. Finally, Eli broke the quiet. "If we're going to live under the same roof, I'd best know your name." Her reply came soft and flat. "Names don't change what's already done." Eli sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I don't know what kind of life you had before Dust Creek, but I ain't the man who put you there. You can start fresh here if you want." For the first time, she turned toward him. The light caught her shawl, and for a moment, Eli saw her face, or at least part of it. Her lips were full but pale, her cheeks smooth on one side and hidden on the other. Her eyes, cold, gray, and bottomless, met his, and he felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. "You think this is a beginning?" she asked. "It's an ending, Eli Carter. You just don't know it yet." His hand froze over the bottle. "You know my name?" She gave a faint, hollow smile. "I know many things about you." A long silence followed, broken only by the popping of the fire. Then she reached up with trembling fingers and began to untie the shawl around her neck. Eli rose to his feet, uncertain, his instincts screaming that he didn't want to see what was underneath. But he couldn't look away. When the shawl finally fell to the floor, the light caught her face fully, and Eli's heart slammed against his ribs. Half of it was burned. The skin twisted and scarred, but not in the random way fire usually leaves its mark. The burns formed a deliberate pattern, a symbol, an iron brand he recognized instantly. It was a sigil of the Hollow Riders, a band of outlaws Eli had hunted years ago as part of a posse during the border wars. They'd been a ruthless gang, raiding settlements, burning ranches. Eli had helped track them down and destroy them. Only, there had been one night he never spoke of, a hideout they'd found deep in the canyon. He remembered the orders, torch it, no survivors. He remembered the screams inside, faint under the crackle of the fire. He'd told himself they were outlaws, all of them. He never looked back. Now, standing before him, the woman lifted her chin, revealing the brand clearer under the firelight. "Do you remember it?" she asked, voice trembling but fierce. "That mark you gave us when you set the cabin aflame?" Eli felt the room spin. "No," he rasped. "That can't be. My father wore this mark. My mother. My little sister, too." Her voice cracked but didn't break. "You called us outlaws, but we were farmers. You didn't even wait to see who was inside." He stumbled back, his throat dry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." The woman took a step closer, her burned face inches from his. "You knew enough to light the match." The fire popped loudly, startling him. Outside, the wind howled harder, shaking the windows. She bent down and picked up the shawl, folding it with care. "You paid for me," she whispered. "Now you'll pay the rest." Eli's knees weakened. For the first time in years, he felt true fear, not of death, but of memory, because now he remembered her, not the woman, but the girl, crying in the doorway of the burning cabin, reaching for someone who never came back, and the sound she made that night, the sound that had haunted his dreams, ever since was the same as her voice now. The days that followed were unlike any Eli Carter had ever known. The ranch, once a place of quiet solitude, now seemed to breathe with something unseen, something old and angry. The woman he had brought home, whose name he still didn't know, moved through the house like a shadow that refused to vanish. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words felt like warnings whispered from another world. At first, Eli tried to carry on as usual. He fed the horses, mended the fences, and tended to the land. But everywhere he went, he felt her presence, watching from a distance, from the porch, from the edge of the fields. Even the animals sensed her. The dogs, loyal for years, now whimpered when she passed. The horses shied away, nostrils flaring, eyes rolling white. On the second morning, Eli found a strange mark burned into the barn door, a circle crossed by a jagged line, the same symbol that had been seared into her scarred face. The wood still smoked as if branded by an invisible hand. He scrubbed at it until his fingers bled, but the mark remained, dark and permanent. When he asked her about it that night, she was sitting by the fire, her back to him. "What did you do to my barn?" he demanded. She didn't turn. "You call it yours," she said quietly. "But everything on this land is built on what you burned." Her calmness unnerved him more than anger ever could. "I told you I didn't know who was in that cabin." You thought you were cleansing evil?" she interrupted. "But you were only spreading it." Her voice was soft, but the flame seemed to flicker harder with each word. That night, Eli dreamed again, dreams he hadn't had in years. He saw the canyon hideout, the night sky bleeding red from the fire he'd started. He saw the flames leap higher, the wood crack, the roof collapse. And through the smoke he saw a child, her small hand reaching out, her face half burned, screaming for help that never came. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the echo of the child's cry still ringing in his ears. On the table beside his bed lay something that hadn't been there before. A burned doll, its glass eyes cracked and its hair singed away. Eli stumbled out of bed and into the cold morning. The woman stood in the yard, her shawl drawn tight, watching the horizon as the sun rose. "What is this?" he shouted, holding up the doll. "Where did you get it?" She looked at him then, and for a fleeting second, he saw something almost tender in her expression. "You remember her, don't you?" He dropped the doll as though it burned him. His hands trembled. That was years ago. I tried to save who I could. I didn't mean for... But you did it, she said simply. And now the land remembers. The fire remembers. And I remember. Eli turned away, gripping his head as fragments of memory stabbed at him. The gunfire, the screaming, the heat of the flames on his face, and the cold realization that he had never faced what he'd done, only buried it deep beneath the quiet life he built afterward. Now, the past had dug its way back up through the dirt. That evening, as darkness fell again, Eli walked out to the barn. The wind had turned sharp and cold, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, though no fire burned nearby. He stared at the strange mark on the door, tracing its edges with trembling fingers. From behind him came her voice, low and distant. You can't wash away ashes, Eli. They cling. They always do. When he turned, she was gone, nothing but her gray shawl fluttering in the doorway, though there was no wind. And for the first time, Eli Carter realized the truth he'd been running from. The woman in his home wasn't just a survivor. She was the embodiment of everything he had destroyed, and she had come to make him face what the fire left behind. By the fifth night, Black Hollow Ranch had become a graveyard of memories. The fire no longer warmed the cabin. It only illuminated the ghosts that lived in Eli Carter's mind. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were hollow, his hands trembling from whiskey and regret. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind made him flinch. The woman was still there, silent most of the time, watching him with eyes that seemed to see through his skin. Sometimes he caught her standing by the barn or the riverbank, staring at nothing. Other times she disappeared for hours, only to return at dusk, smelling faintly of smoke. Eli didn't ask where she went. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. That morning, he found her sitting at the kitchen table. For the first time, she wasn't wearing her shawl. The burn scars on her face looked softer in the morning light, almost human. She had placed something in front of her on the table, a revolver. His old Colt, the same one he'd used during the war, long since stored away in a chest he hadn't opened in years. Eli froze in the doorway. Where'd you get that? She looked up, her voice calm. It was where you left it. In the dark. His throat tightened. That gun's got more ghosts than I care to count. She nodded slowly. Then it's the right one. She slid it across the table toward him. The metal scraped against the wood, a sound that echoed like judgment. You paid for me, she said softly. Now finish it. Eli stared at her, confused. Finish what? Her eyes glimmered, half sorrow, half fury. You lit the fire that night. You ended us. And yet here you stand, breathing, eating, pretending you can forget. You can't leave this world owing that kind of debt. He took a shaky breath. If you came here for vengeance, then take it. Do it yourself. She rose, her movements deliberate, almost graceful. No, Eli, this isn't mine to do. You took life into your hands once before. Now you'll use them to take your own. That's justice. Eli looked down at the revolver. It was old but clean, as if she had oiled it herself. He could almost feel the weight of the years in it, the lives it had taken, the pain it had delivered. His hands trembled as he reached for it. Why now? He whispered. After all these years, why come back? Her voice softened, a faint tremor breaking through. Because I waited. I waited in the ashes. I waited for someone to remember what you forgot. You burned my family alive, Eli, but you didn't just kill them, you killed me, too. The girl I was died that night. The woman standing here is just what's left. Tears stung his eyes. He hadn't cried since the war. I was following orders, he muttered, voice cracking. She shook her head. You were following fear. They stood in silence for a long time, the fire popping behind them, the wind clawing at the windows. Finally, she spoke again, almost a whisper. There's peace waiting for you, Eli, but you'll have to walk through the same fire you gave us to find it. He nodded slowly, a broken man understanding the end he had earned. He lifted the revolver, pressing it against his chest. She stepped closer, placing her burned hand over his. Her touch was cold. Do you forgive me? He asked, his voice barely audible. She looked at him for a long moment, then said the words that sealed his fate. Forgiveness isn't mine to give. Only the fire can decide that. As dawn crept over the hills, a single shot echoed across the valley. Birds scattered from the trees. The wind stilled for a moment as if the land itself was holding its breath. When it moved again, the woman was gone. Only Eli remained, slumped forward over the table, the revolver at his side and the faint smell of smoke curling through the cabin like the ghost of a memory finally set free. The news spread slowly through the frontier, carried by travelers and drifters who stopped at Dust Creek for a drink and a story. They said the Black Hollow Ranch was abandoned now, the fields empty, the corral gates hanging loose in the wind. The old rancher, Eli Carter, had been found dead in his cabin, one bullet through the heart, his revolver still in his hand. There were 2 graves by the river, one marked with a wooden cross carved with the initials EC, and beside it another, unmarked, silent, and forever anonymous. The townsfolk whispered that Eli had buried her before turning the gun on himself. Others said there was never a second body at all. No one could agree on what really happened that final night. The sheriff rode out a few days after the rumors began. He'd known Eli from the war and couldn't believe the man had taken his own life. But when he reached the ranch, a chill ran through him. The land felt wrong, too still, too quiet. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though there were no embers anywhere. Inside the cabin, everything was in order, the dishes cleaned, the firewood stacked neatly by the door. But the sheriff's eyes were drawn to the far wall, where a symbol had been burned into the wood, a circle crossed by a jagged line. The same mark that had appeared on barns, fences, and the memories of those who'd known the Hollow Riders. He left quickly, uneasy, feeling as though the walls were watching him. On his way out, he swore he saw a figure at the edge of the trees, a woman in a gray shawl standing perfectly still. When he blinked, she was gone. That was when the stories began. Ranch hands claimed they'd seen a pale figure wandering the riverbanks at dusk, her shawl fluttering in the wind, her reflection rippling in the water, though she left no footprints on the sand. Riders passing near Black Hollow swore they heard a woman's voice whispering, carried by the wind through the canyon. "You paid for me." Now finish it. The preacher in Dust Creek called it superstition, saying Eli's guilt had driven him mad. But the older folks, the ones who'd lived long enough to know the land had memory, whispered that the woman wasn't human at all. They said she'd been dead long before Eli brought her home. Her name, they remembered, was Anna Reed years ago. Her family had been caught in the fire that destroyed the Hollow Riders' hideout, a fire started by Eli Carter and his men. The report said all had perished, but one body was never found, Anna's. Some said she escaped, half burned and half mad. Others swore she had died there, and what returned to Dust Creek that night wasn't her body, but her spirit, born from smoke and vengeance, drawn back to the man who had lit the match. The truth was lost somewhere between both versions. Season after season, the ranch decayed. The fields grew wild, the fences fell, and the cabins sagged beneath the weight of time. But travelers who camped nearby said they still heard things. The creak of a chair on the porch, boots walking across the floor, a woman's low voice humming a lullaby that ended in a sob. Some nights, a faint orange glow flickered in the windows as though a fire still burned inside. Yet when the brave few rode closer, the light vanished, leaving only darkness and the whisper of the wind. In Dust Creek, the auctioneer who had sold the veiled woman never returned. His ledger still sat on the counter of the old saloon, open to that night's page. Every name had a number beside it, except for one. Next to the last entry, written in fading ink, was a single word, paid. And so the legend of Black Hollow lived on, not as a tale of love or justice, but as a warning whispered to those who thought they could outrun what they'd done. Because out there, in the cold wind between the canyons, they say you can still see her standing at the edge of the river, her shawl gray as ash, her voice soft as dust, and if you listen closely, you'll hear her say the words that ended Eli Carter's life. "You paid for me. Now finish it."